So we're halfway through the summer of 2025, and I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation about where we're at when it comes to physical collecting for video games, whether that be retro games or modern games. And I think that slowly but surely we're continuing to see a shift. And I kind of wanted to just talk about it from my perspective after having done a little bit of game hunting and also after having participated in a couple of swap and trade events, and just kind of from the perspective of someone who's on YouTube and who makes this type of content. Now, at a very high level, there are some consoles that it seems the general public just doesn't really care about that much anymore. And it's understandable. When you consider consoles like the Sega Saturn or the PlayStation Portable, most people don't even own these consoles anymore. So the idea of going out and purchasing these games don't really make a lot of sense. Now, you do have probably more people who have a Dreamcast, but when it comes to the Dreamcast, the games for this console are so easy to pirate, they're so easy to burn on, onto blank discs, that I don't really know if a lot of people are going out and spending the type of money that the Dreamcast library demands. And then you have handhelds like the PlayStation Vita, which is probably the most, not probably, but is the most modern of all of these consoles. Yet and still, you don't see the type of enthusiasm for even the PS Vita the same way you did maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And it's because I think for a lot of people, they are moving on. They've moved on to consoles like the PlayStation 5 and the Nintendo Switch and the Switch 2. And those consoles have kind of taken over. Even from a physical standpoint, you've got more and more people who are opting to leave retro altogether, forget about their retro libraries, and go all in on modern day consoles for all types of issues. A lot of times, some of the biggest reasons that you'll hear is due to scarcity when it comes to the retro gaming market. Of course, with that scarcity comes high prices that most people aren't really willing to pay these days to get games that in their minds they feel like they can either emulate or buy from some sort of eShop. And then the competition is just wildly fierce. So all of these have really played a role in where we're at today with collecting physical games and specifically physical retro games. Now, I've been a channel that's really focused on retro game collecting for quite some time. And even though I've had a Nintendo Switch library and I've built a PlayStation 4 library and things of that nature, I always like to keep my eye on what's happening with retro games because to me, in my mind, I've always felt like retro was something that I've wanted to preserve even more so than my more modern games because I honestly feel like Switch games and PlayStation 4 games and PlayStation 5 games, we have a much longer runway to collect those games physically than we do when it comes to these retro games because a lot of them are disappearing from the market. They're breaking, they're suffering from disc rot, they're shutting down, people are losing them, all sorts of things. And all of these things play a role in where we're at with physical collections and people physically collecting these games. Now, this is what I've seen. There has been a shift in terms of who collects these games, who buys these games, and who's actually out and about looking for these games, and also where you can go to actually source these games. Now, when you start looking at quality retro games, retro titles that aren't common, or even consoles that aren't common, what I've noticed is that those are becoming harder and harder to find in person. Now, there are a select number of mom and pop shops all over the country that understand how important these types of games are to the retro gaming community. And so they really do their best to try to make sure that they have a high quality and a large variety of these games in stock at their stores. But what I've noticed is that that's become more and more difficult to achieve as I go to different mom and pop shops, not only in my city and in my metro area, but around the country as a whole. And so with that, you're finding less and less buyers and less of a market for these types of games because most of the diehard collectors already have what they want. They've built their collections, they understand what they're into, and they're not really looking to really add anything new. And I think that we're seeing less and less new personnel. We're seeing less and less newcomers to the hobby of collecting for retro. In fact, I think from what I've seen on YouTube, I've seen more collectors that I've actually followed sell their consoles and sell their collections away. I see more and more people getting out of retro these days than I do see people getting into it. And a lot of people are just straight up cashing out. And so, what this translates to when you're out and about in the field, you're out hunting, what I see is that physical collecting is a hobby that's really shared between resellers and collectors these days, more than necessarily the end user or the end buyer, someone who's actually going to buy the game, take it home, play it, and then put it on their shelf and keep it forever and ever and ever. We're just not seeing that anymore. Some of the last events that I went to, 70% of the folks at the event were obvious resellers or diehard collectors. And I would say maybe 20 to 25%, 30 max, were people who were genuinely just game players, casual players, people who were just looking to add games to their collection. And believe it or not, most of those people who were the end user, they weren't looking for Giga Wing or Silent Hill Book of Memories. They were looking for games like Mario Party DS or Tetris or Mario Party Paper Jam or you know something very common. They were looking for the very common games. They were looking for the very easy to play type of games, the more popular games, the games that they've seen and probably grew up with. And I think this is a big part of the reason why when people open up retro game stores, that having those common low dollar titles is so vitally important to have on the shelves in a retro game store, because those are the games that more casual buyers are looking for than necessarily, the more harder to find, more rare or quote unquote banger titles. And even when folks, the casual gamers, come in and buy these games, they might buy one or two of these kind of like casual type of games, and they're going to actually go home and play those games for months and months and months. And then when they're done, they're either going to sell them back or trade them away, but they're not collecting consistently day over day, adding games to their collection. And so this is impacting the physical collecting market, in my opinion. And the there's a good and a bad, right? And it depends on what side of the coin that you fall on. Now, prices are not dropping like a stone. I think in some markets and in some areas, some of these game prices are going down, but they're not falling as fast as probably some people might want them to, because like I said in the beginning of this video, most of the people who want these games have them and they've built their collections up and they're really not letting them go. So the supply that's in the market is going to be the supply forever, because it's not like more of these games are being made. They're just, they're going to fall out. More and more of them are going to actually fall out of the market due to just breaking down and things of that nature. And so we're seeing this reversion back to the older days, I think, of retro game collecting and physical collecting, where the hobby is made up of primarily diehard retro gamers, collectors, and resellers, and everything is really being maneuvered within that small pool, of people who make up that market. And because they all are aware of price charting, because they're all aware of which games are rare and which games are scarce, it's really holding up these game prices. And I think these game prices are going to be held up until there's another major catalyst that either causes them to fall in price or causes them to go up in price. Now, more and more people that I talk to seem to think that we're probably going to see a rise in retro game prices over the next decade, more so than we'll probably see a fall in prices for retro games over the next decade, due to a lot of the reasons that I mentioned earlier in the video when it comes to scarcity, when it comes to rarity, and when it comes to, just games being available and that, that constituent of the market being there. But I think that there could be another renaissance, so to speak, when it comes to people who have genuine interest in some of these games that they cannot stream, that aren't available on some type of, streaming platform. And the only way that they can kind of get access to them is emulation. So emulation aside, for those who want to have the full nostalgic experience of playing these games on physical consoles, I don't really see prices changing, because there could be a time where we see a new generation that discovers, oh shoot, there was a console like the Sega Saturn. I wonder what that was like. And that's going to continue to happen until the end of time. 5, 6 generations from now, there's going to be a kid somewhere who's going to want to know what a vinyl record sounds like on a record player, right? 10 generations from now, there's going to be a kid who's going to want to know what it feels like to drive a 65 Mustang. Um, 20 years from now, there's going to be someone who's going to pick up a camera and want to know what it feels like to shoot photos on a lens that was built back in 1975. And a lot of people can say, well, you know what, Y2K, there's going to be AI. You know, AI is going to obliterate all of these things. Artificial intelligence is going to take over. Yes, but I think when you say that, you kind of discount the power of human nature and the human need for creativity, the human need for connectivity. And while AI will offer us some opportunities in terms of productivity and being able to get things done faster, and kind of having this microwave approach to creativity, I think there's always going to be that desire for something more organic and something that feels a little bit more original, at least for the next few generations. I don't really think we're going to see this massive shift in my lifetime. I don't think so. Maybe in my children's lifetime, we might see a major shift, but I think even if nothing else, these things will stay around and serve as relics, as tokens of a time past when video games felt this archaic. We don't know what the future is going to look like, but we do know that these items are becoming more and more scarce. And like anything else in human history that dwindles over time and the availability goes further and further down, that just contributes to the whole supply and demand concept. So I think from a physical standpoint and collecting as it pertains to people who collect physically today, I think those who share the mindset that scarcity is going to reign supreme in the future, they're hanging on to their physical video games and they're continuing to build their collections. And I think they're going after the stuff that's harder to find because they know that these things will become even harder to find in the future, right? The odds of you being able to find a Just Dance 2019 will be a lot higher than you being able to find Batman Forever, the arcade game, whether it's on the Sega Saturn or the PlayStation 1. And I think these paradigms are being reflected in the prices that we see. Even if these are paradigms that are only shared between resellers and retro game collectors and just the members of the die-hard community. What does that mean for you if you're someone who's interested in getting into retro video games, if you're wanting to build your collection and add to a library, or even just start building a library of retro games? Well, it means start small, and it means start with one console. Start with a console that's manageable and start doing it in a way where you're not having to spend a lot of money out of pocket to get these games. I always recommend starting with the PlayStation Portable because it's probably the cheapest library out of everything that you see here. The PSP is cheap, and it's not just cheap in person, it's also cheap online. A lot of the PlayStation Portable games have gone down a lot. Out of all these consoles, the library that's fallen the most, I would say, from the pandemic highs is the PSP, because a lot of the really high dollar games have lost 40, 50, in some cases 70% of their value, and you can get a lot of really amazing games on the PSP for really cheap. The challenge with the PSP is finding a working, I find that finding a working North American PlayStation Portable these days is becoming more and more challenging. Um, I would say that we're seeing those handhelds break down a lot more and a lot faster than a lot of the others that I've seen. The good thing is that there's three versions. You have the 1000, the 2000, and the 3000 series. And so you have that kind of keeps a lot of those handhelds in circulation. I would say if you can get your hand on a 2000 series and a 1000 series, I would definitely say try to get your hands on that. You should be able to get both for under $100, but this library is actually really solid. The PlayStation Portable is definitely one that I would look into, and you can slowly build that collection. I would say behind that, I would say maybe the Dreamcast. While the Dreamcast is a very expensive library, there are a lot of quality games that you can get for not as expensive prices, or not so expensive. You can definitely start to build a physical collection. Dreamcast hardware is expensive. I'm noticing that more and more of the consoles are starting to have issues and malfunctions. Even the Dreamcast consoles in my collection have started to get wonky. I actually had to have one of mine repaired, and after that one went out on me, I decided to go and get a backup Dreamcast just in case. So I would say that would be probably another good option. The Vita is alive and kicking, and I would say that the Vita secondary market, like the emulation and the homebrew market for Vita, is really still alive and kicking. And there's a strong community of lovers of the Vita out there. You could join some Reddit boards and find some online communities that could really guide you through the Vita library and help you make sense of the best ways to collect for that console. Kind of like the PSP, you've got multiple versions of that handheld that you can go for. And most Vitas will kind of run you around 150, maybe 160. You could probably find a good Vita cheaper than that, but I do know that GameStop has a bunch of Vitas available on their website. So if you want to get just original hardware, you can play it on the Vita. Probably the last option or the last console I would recommend anyone going for these days is the Sega Saturn. It's just one of the more tricky consoles. It's not as prevalent as any of these others. When there's an issue with your Sega Saturn, I mean, you're gonna have a hard time with it. And I just don't know if the library is gonna be as appealing to as many people. It's a smaller library, and I think you could probably get more bang for your buck going with other consoles. The Saturn is also expensive. There's this wide chasm when it comes to the Saturn. Like all of the really good games or games that are worth playing are really expensive, and then the cheaper games have a massive drop off in fun factor and just playability. So take that for what you will. I would say at the end of the day, do your research before you start getting into any of these physical libraries. And really, if you're going to get into physical collecting, do it because, you know, it's something that you're passionate about. Do not do it as some way of kind of, you know, thinking you're building wealth by buying retro games. I definitely wouldn't recommend that, because the hype and the euphoria around retro is definitely gone. And so just know that when you get into this pool of physical collecting, you're really going to be swimming in a pond filled with resellers, collectors, and, you know, hyper engaged enthusiasts. The casual collector of retro games has kind of moved on to other things, whether it be Pokemon, um, you know, plushies, other collectibles, all types of other stuff, and the hype around this has died. So know what you're talking about when you go shopping for these things, because most people who are into this hobby are really knowledgeable, and you always want to know what you're buying and what you're getting into so that you're not getting got from a price perspective. I do think physical retro games are still a valid thing. I think physical collecting is here to stay for a while. I just don't think it's as I don't think it's as mainstream. Of course, we'll see the occasional news article pop up. You'll see the occasional story on some type of TV broadcast. In fact, I saw something the other day where on some show they were talking about retro video games, and I think they had a NES game inside of a Super Nintendo console on display. I can't remember. I felt like I saw that somewhere. And I think you're always going to see every once in a while these stories pop up that kind of highlight retro game collecting. But the popularity has definitely worn off in terms of just it being a mainstream thing. And rightfully so. We're 5 years, post the highs of physical retro game collecting. And now more people are looking at the Switch 2, and trying to decide if, you know, getting a key card or downloading games is even worth it these days. But those are my just really high level rambling thoughts around physical collecting. I do think it's valid. I think the hype is gone. But I think that it's still something worth looking into and getting into. You just have to do your research and know exactly what it is you want to buy and what you want to play, and then I think you'll see a lot of success and find a lot of enjoyment there. But you guys, let me know what you think about the current world of physical collecting, whether it be retro games or even just modern games. Where do you think physical collecting is today? Where do you think it's going in the next 5 years? Like where will we be with physical collecting, say in 2030? And that's going to be coming up a lot faster than you think it is. Time is flying, folks. We're already more than halfway through 2025, and it feels like it just started. So let me know what you think in the comments down below, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.